The Midnight Healer. Episode 5. What Healers Forget. An original urban fantasy audiobook series. The first thing Evra ever taught her was how to breathe. Not metaphorically. Not in the way of meditation teachers and yoga instructors who use the word breathe as shorthand for calm yourself. Dear, you are embarrassing us both. Evra meant it literally, anatomically, almost clinically, with the kind of precision she reserved for things she had decided were sacred. Ayla was 16 years old. She had been standing in Evra's study for approximately 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, she had managed to knock over a brass candle holder, apologize 3 times, right the candle holder, and then knock it over again. She was, in her own private estimation, a catastrophe. A girl-shaped apology walking around in the world. Her power had come in 6 weeks before, sudden, unannounced, arriving in the middle of a school examination like an uninvited uncle who helps himself to the food and rearranges the furniture, and since then she had not slept well. She was terrified of herself. She was terrified of what she could do. She had heard the word healer used about her exactly once, by the city's Veil liaison who'd come to the flat where she and her guardian lived, and the word had sat inside her chest ever since, like a stone she didn't know how to set down. Evra had looked at her for a long, unhurried moment, the kind of look that saw straight past performance and took a precise inventory of the actual person standing underneath, and then she'd said. Evra told her to sit before the candle holder suffered another heroic collision, adding that it had belonged to her grandmother and that she was determined it would outlive them both. Then, simply and precisely, she told Ayla to breathe. Young Ayla sat. She breathed. Evra rejected the effort at once, calling it panic, wearing a little coat and pretending to be breath. She asked for something deeper and slower, the breath Ayla might have used before the world had frightened her, and asked if she could remember it. Young Ayla had to think about it. The honest answer was, not really. Not lately. Young Ayla said she thought she could try. Evra approved of trying because it was honest, and warned that certainty at 16 was almost always a danger sign. She instructed Ayla to breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6, and to begin. She breathed. In. Out. In. Out. The fire made small sounds. The rain did its patient work against the window. And slowly, very slowly, like a fist unclenching, the trembling in her hands began to ease. Evra watched. She was in her early 60s then, with close-cropped natural gray hair and a face that had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was done with apology and was very comfortable with that decision. She was wearing a cardigan, an extraordinary cardigan, patterned with small terracotta diamonds, over a set of ritual robes that probably cost more than everything Ayla owned. And she had the amber eyes of someone who had learned that patience was not the same thing as passivity. On the table beside her, a mug of tea. A crossword puzzle, half finished. A small candle burning in a clay holder that had, evidently, survived the encounter with the 16-year-old. She waited until Ayla's breathing was steady. Then she said, when Ayla's breathing settled, Evra asked her to tell the story of the first time it had happened. Young Ayla explained that she had been in the middle of a mathematics examination, quadratic equations, of all things, when she felt the old injury in the girl beside her, Petra, as a note held just out of tune. Before she understood what she was doing, something moved through her. Petra's wrist healed properly. The X-ray showed perfect bone, and for 2 days afterward Ayla carried a hairline fracture in exactly the same place. Evra asked whether that had frightened her. Young Ayla admitted that it had frightened her more than anything ever had. Evra called that fear a sign that Ayla had been paying attention. Anyone who claimed power should feel easy, she said, had either never held enough of it or had stopped noticing what it could cost. Then she asked what else Ayla had felt. Young Ayla hesitated. This was the part she hadn't told the Veil liaison. This was the part she'd barely admitted to herself. Young Ayla confessed that, despite the pain and fear, it had felt right, not safe or simple, but right, as if the whole room had been holding a wrong note and, for 1 second, that note resolved. Evra told her that it did not sound impossible at all. It sounded exact, like the first honest sentence a midnight healer ever says about the gift. She stood then, unhurried, the way she did everything, and crossed to the window that overlooked a small walled garden below. Veilport's old quarter spread around the house in its particular way, cobblestones worn smooth by a century of footsteps, crooked lamplight, the smell of salt from the harbor 3 streets over. The ley lines ran beneath all of it, beneath the oldest part of the city, and on clear nights, or so Ayla had been told, you could see them in the faces of the people who lived above them. Something in the eyes. A quality of light that didn't quite have a name. Evra explained that most healers worked from the outside inward, with salves, stitches, and careful threads of ley line energy aimed at damage, useful, sensible, and mercifully limited. What midnight healers did was different, and she asked Ayla to name how. Young Ayla answered that they took the hurt through themselves. Evra confirmed it. Midnight healers became the passage. The wound moved through them, and the ley lines burned it clean before it could settle. That was the mercy, and also the danger. Every healing was a choice, even when the body made it before the mind arrived. Their work over the next several years would be teaching Ayla's mind to arrive on time. Evra turned from the window. There was something alert in her expression, not quite a smile, but the cousin of one. Then Evra told her to come along, because there was a better lesson waiting in the garden. The garden was small and impractical and beloved. It had been planted without much design and maintained with enormous care, herbs crowding the beds, a fig tree in the corner that had absolutely no business thriving this far north, but was doing so anyway, out of sheer stubbornness. Against the back wall, a raised bed of what appeared to be medicinal plants, each one labeled in Evra's brisk handwriting on small clay stakes. And there, beneath the fig tree, on the wet stone of the garden wall, sat a sparrow. It was hunched in that way of injured birds, that small, effortful stillness that is nothing like sleep. Its left wing was held at a wrong angle. Not dramatically broken, not catastrophically so, but wrong. You could see the slight asymmetry in how it held itself, the way it tilted its weight. Evra said she had found the sparrow that morning after its unfortunate argument with the kitchen window, an argument the window remained wholly unrepentant about. The bird's wing, she believed, was cleanly fractured, a hairline near the secondary covert. Young Ayla understood that Evra wanted her to heal him. Evra clarified that she wanted Ayla to try. They were not promising the bird miracles. They were offering care, method, attention, and humility. The rest would be a conversation between Ayla, the wound, and something older than either of them. Young Ayla said again that she could try. She approached the bird slowly. It watched her with one bright, suspicious eye. She was acutely aware of its smallness, the whole intricate fact of it, the beating life inside such a tiny architecture of feather and hollow bone. She thought, I could hurt this. I am trying to help and I could hurt this. She breathed. In at 4 counts, out at 6. She put her hands out, palms up, just below the level of the wall, not touching, not yet. And she listened. Not with her ears. With the other thing, the thing that had woken up 6 weeks ago, the thing that didn't have a name yet but knew how to feel the shape of wrong. And there it was, a small singing discord, fine as a thread, near the bird's left wing. A hairline. Yes, exactly where Evra had said. Evra told her to stay with the breath and let it keep her hands honest. She breathed. She felt the ley lines below her, distant, vast, patient as geological time, and she understood, in a way that was physical before it was intellectual, that they were not simply energy. They were memory. They were the record of every healing that had ever happened in this city, every correction the healers had made, and they remembered. They knew what rightness felt like. And when she reached toward them with the fragile thread of her gift, they responded not with a flood, not with the ungoverned surge that had come on its own in the examination room, but with something proportionate, careful, almost gentle, precisely calibrated to what was needed. The fracture passed into her. It was brief, a sharp, specific pain in her left hand, there and then gone, burned clean by the lines before it could settle into her. In the space of 2 breaths. The sparrow looked at her. Then it opened its wings, both wings, symmetrical and perfect, and was gone. Young Ayla stood in the rain and watched the empty air where it had been. She was shaking, not from cold, not from pain, not from fear. From something else entirely. Something she didn't have a word for yet. After the sparrow flew, Evra told Ayla that she had done better than good. She had been precise. She had not poured herself into the wound simply because she could, and that restraint mattered. Beginners often mistook generosity for control, flooding, overgiving, leaving nothing of themselves standing, but Ayla had listened instead. Then Evra led her back inside before the rain could make a permanent lesson of their shoes. They went inside. Evra made tea with the efficiency of someone who has made tea approximately 10,000 times and sees no reason to make a ceremony of it. She handed a mug to young Ayla and settled into her chair by the fire, and for a moment she was quiet. Her amber eyes were on the middle distance, thinking something through. Then she looked at the girl sitting across from her, wet-shouldered, glowing with that particular afterlight that healers carry briefly after a ley line connection, and she said the thing that Ayla would carry for the rest of her life, in the very marrow of how she understood herself. By the fire, Evra gave her the lesson Ayla would carry for the rest of her life. The ley lines did not give power. They lent it, and every loan carried a cost. She held the mug in both hands. The fire made small sounds. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. Evra told her never to forget what she was spending, and never to pretend the spending belonged to no one. Scene 1. The street was called Aurora Lane, which had always struck Ayla as a beautiful name for such a narrow, unpretentious place. It had never quite decided whether it wanted to be a proper street or merely an extended alley, and had arrived at a compromise, too wide to be ignored, too crooked to be mapped efficiently, lined on both sides with townhouses that had grown slightly into each other over the years, like old friends leaning together without meaning to. Number 14 had a blue door. It had always had a blue door. Evra had repainted it every 3 years without fail, the exact same shade, a particular deep teal that she'd once described, only half-jokingly, as the color of a sea that has given up being dramatic and chosen instead to be quietly extraordinary. The paint was still good. Someone, a neighbor, perhaps someone who'd loved her, had kept the step swept. The iron knocker was a fox's head, and Ayla remembered being 14 years old, sitting on the step, waiting for Evra to answer, tracing the fox's ears with one finger while she rehearsed what she was going to say, because even then, before she was a healer, before she understood anything about ley lines or the witching window or the cost of what she'd one day become, she had understood that this house contained someone worth being articulate for. The window boxes had gone to seed. That was the thing that undid her, standing on the pavement in the long gray morning of a Veilport spring. Not the dark windows. Not the absence of the light that had always burned in the study on the upper floor, visible from the street, reliable as a lighthouse. Not even the fox-head knocker, green-touched now with neglect. It was the window boxes, because Evra had grown specific things in them, things she used, things she was particular about, and she had tended them with disproportionate attention for a woman who claimed to be unsentimental. Lavender, and some variety of thyme, and a small sprawling rosemary that had become, over the years, an argument for what rosemary could achieve if given sufficient encouragement and a south-facing window. They were bare now. The stems that remained were brittle and colorless, and the soil had cracked at the edges. 6 months of no one. Ayla had the key in her coat pocket. She had carried it for 6 months without using it. The veil had sealed the property provisionally, standard procedure for a practitioner's death, pending review, but the seal had expired 3 weeks ago and she'd received notice, very formally, on very official paper, that she was listed as Evra's designated executor and that the property was now her administrative responsibility. She had put the letter in a drawer. She had thought about it every day since. She had not come. She had told herself she was busy, which was true. She had told herself there was no urgency, which was increasingly false. She had told herself she wasn't ready. That one she'd stopped pretending to believe about 3 weeks ago. She was 28 years old, the last true midnight healer in Veilport, possibly in the world, and there was a plague eating through the ley lines beneath her feet. And the woman who had trained her and loved her and taught her everything she knew had died alone with knowledge that might be the only thread connecting all of it, and Ayla had been standing on the pavement outside the blue door for 11 minutes. The new silver streak at her temple caught the pale morning light as she finally moved, the one that hadn't been there 2 days ago, before the healing in the warehouse district that had taken too much out of her and given the ley lines just enough to burn through. She didn't look in mirrors much lately. She wasn't sure she wanted to see the cost accumulating. She put the key in the lock. It turned easily. Of course it did. Evra had always kept the lock oiled, because she was practical in ways that most people weren't, because she maintained things. She maintained things, and her window boxes grew, and her fire burned in the upper study, and she was here. She was always here, and then she wasn't, and the window boxes went to seed. And Ayla had been standing in the ruins of that particular sentence for 6 months, not quite knowing how to finish it. She opened the blue door and went in. Scene 2. It smelled like her. Still. 6 months later, with the windows closed and the air stale, and the dust beginning its patient work on every horizontal surface, it still smelled unmistakably like Evra. Tea and paper and something herbal that Ayla had never been able to identify exactly. Not lavender, not sage, something older and more complicated. Something that had probably been absorbed by the walls themselves over decades of a particular person living particularly fully inside them. Ayla stood just inside the front hall and breathed it in. In at 4 counts. Out at 6. The hall was narrow and cluttered in the specific way of someone who had too many books and had made their peace with that. Shelves floor to ceiling on both sides, with objects threaded between the volumes, a small carved figure, a ceramic bowl full of dried petals, a framed photograph that Ayla couldn't quite see in the dimness, but knew was of two women laughing on a harbor somewhere warm. She didn't let herself look at the photograph. Not yet. She went to the kitchen first. She didn't plan to. Her feet knew the way. The mug was on its hook. The one that said, in large, faded letters, on a background that had once been a bright cornflower blue, "World's most adequate healer," a gift from a student 20 years ago that Evra had used every single day with absolutely no irony and, Ayla suspected, a great deal of private satisfaction. It was on its hook beside the others, waiting, as though the morning she'd failed to use it had simply been running long. Ayla pressed one hand flat against the kitchen worktop and breathed through it. The grief was not a wave. She'd been braced for a wave for months, and the wave hadn't come, and she'd begun to wonder if she was broken or simply deferred. But it wasn't a wave. It was more like a pressure, constant and all-directional, the kind that is not dramatic, but simply present, the way the weight of ocean is present at depth. It pressed against her chest and her throat and the backs of her eyes, and she breathed through it. In the sitting room, the crossword puzzle on the side table. Half finished. The pen uncapped beside it. 3 across had been completed with a word that Ayla looked at and immediately understood was wrong, deliberately, gleefully wrong, because Evra had done crosswords not to complete them but to argue with them. And she had written in a spectacular piece of nonsense with an air of triumph that Ayla could hear across 6 months and the boundary of death itself. She laughed. It startled her, the laugh, because she hadn't expected it to come. It arrived the way grief does, apparently, through any door. The cardigan was on the chair. Not the terracotta diamonds one, a different one. This one was moss green, slightly unraveling at one cuff, with a pocket that was visibly distorted by the weight of something Evra perpetually kept in it. Ayla reached in and found, as she knew she would, a piece of chalk, a folded receipt for something at the herbalist, and a small smooth stone serpentine, sea-polished, from some beach on some occasion Ayla didn't know the story of. She put the stone in her own pocket. Then she went upstairs, to the study. The study was the truest room in the house, the room most completely Evra's, most saturated with her. Floor-to-ceiling shelves again, but here they were organized with the seriousness of someone who had done primary research in this space for 35 years. The books were a mixture, medical texts alongside ritual practice, alchemical histories alongside epidemiological surveys, everything cross-referenced in Evra's marginal handwriting, a conversation she'd been having with every author, some of whom had been dead for a century, none of whom had been entirely right. The desk was at the window. On it, a lamp, a blotter, a jar of pens, a small framed image that Ayla now let herself look at, and it was what she expected. Young Evra, perhaps 40, laughing with genuine hilarity at something out of frame, in a garden somewhere. She looked exactly the same and entirely different. The laugh was identical. Ayla sat in the desk chair. She didn't know what she was looking for. She had told herself she was here to begin sorting, to be responsible, to discharge her executor duties with the practical competence Evra would have respected. That was approximately 10% true. The rest of the truth was, she was here because the Ashening was spreading, and Evra had known about it, and Evra had been careful, more careful than Ayla had ever understood, and somewhere in this house were answers that Evra had not lived long enough to give her. She sat for a moment and looked at the floor. Old floorboards, wide plank, slightly uneven, the color of dark honey. She had sat in this exact chair looking at this exact floor dozens of times, during lessons, during arguments, during the particular companionable silences that had been one of the great gifts of their relationship. The ability to be in a room together without filling all the air with noise. And she noticed something now that she could not explain not noticing before, except that before she hadn't been looking. Hadn't needed to. One board, just below and to the left of the desk, was not the same color as the others. Almost. Very nearly. But not quite. A fraction darker, a fraction less worn, as though it had been replaced more recently than its neighbors. And the join between that board and the next was too clean. Not with age work. With intention. She pressed. She felt not with her hands, but with the thing behind her hands, a ward. Small, compact, exquisitely designed. Not a ward meant to keep people out through force, a ward meant to keep things from being felt, from registering, from drawing the eye. A do-not-look ward, layered through the grain of the wood itself. It was old, several years old, at least, and it was built with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly how such things were dismantled and had arranged, therefore, that it should be very difficult to dismantle quickly. It would take a brute force practitioner perhaps 3 hours to unpick it without knowing the keying element. Ayla knew the keying element. She breathed in through 4 counts and exhaled through 6, and at the exact crest of the exhale she said, in a voice barely above a murmur. In a voice barely above a murmur, Ayla repeated Evra's old warning to never forget what was being spent. The board lifted cleanly. Beneath it, in a cavity that had been cut with care into the joist space, wrapped in a cloth that had been treated with a preservation ward, she could feel it, the careful, layered attention of it, the intention woven through every fold, were the journals. 4 of them. Bound in dark cloth, tied with cord, each one labeled on the spine in Evra's brisk handwriting with a system that was not immediately transparent, letters and numbers, apparently arbitrary. In a sequence that Ayla stared at for several seconds before understanding that it was deliberately opaque. She lifted them out with both hands. They were heavier than they looked. She set them on the desk and sat looking at them in the thin morning light from the study window. She was not going to do this alone. The thought arrived without drama, without argument, which was how she knew it was true. 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, she would have argued with it, would have insisted on the privacy of this, the specific geography of her grief, the particular rights of a student to mourn a teacher without witnesses. Now she sat with 4 journals on a dead woman's desk and understood that stubbornness in the face of a problem this size was not integrity. It was vanity. She took out her phone and made a call. Scene 3. She met him at the door. Cade Morrow in daylight was, she had noted on previous occasions, a slightly different proposition from Cade Morrow in darkness, which was when she most often encountered him. In daylight you could see his face clearly, could see that he was actually not as hard-edged as he appeared at 1 in the morning in a warehouse or an alley or any of the other places their work tended to put them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in the charcoal coat he wore as others wore skin, and his amber-brown eyes were taking in the blue door and the window boxes and the general geography of the place with the precise, involuntary assessment of someone who had spent years reading locations the way other people read faces. He looked at her. Whatever he read in her face, he kept to himself. At the door, Cade said only that Ayla had found something in Evra's study. Ayla told him to come upstairs, where she would show him. She had not, in the phone call, said much more than Evra's house. The study. Come. There had been a silence on his end, brief, the kind of silence that contains a calculation, and then 20 minutes. She had appreciated the 20 minutes. It meant he was already in the old quarter. It meant he had been nearby. She wasn't sure if that was surveillance or something less named, and she had decided, at least for today, not to examine it. Calling him had not been easy. She was aware of that, even if she couldn't have given a fully articulate account of why. It wasn't distrust, or not primarily distrust, not any longer. The architecture of her wariness around Cade Morrow had been shifting in ways she monitored, but hadn't yet found language for. It was something closer to the specific exposure of asking for help in the middle of a grief she had carefully kept private. She had called him because she needed him. And she had done it immediately, once she understood she needed him, because Evra had once told her that there are two kinds of people who are slow to ask for help, the humble and the proud. Humility, Evra had said, acts as soon as it understands the situation. Pride waits until it can frame the asking as something other than asking. Ayla had called immediately. In the study, she showed him the board first, then the cloth-wrapped stack, then the journals spread on the desk. He looked at each in turn with the same steady, collecting attention. He did not touch anything without looking at her first, which she noticed. Which mattered, though she didn't say so. Cade recognized at once that the spine marks were deliberate, a code built into the order. Ayla agreed. The marks were not dates, not a simple sequence. Evra would have expected anyone to check that first, so she had hidden the code sideways, in something personal enough to matter and ordinary enough to overlook. Cade understood the logic, meaningful to Evra, invisible to anyone else. Ayla observed that it was fortunate, then, that she was not anyone else. She pulled a chair around to the desk, the only other chair in the room, a straight-backed thing from the corner, and sat beside him, and they spread the 4 journals out and looked. The spine codes were R7 Ren. B2, sure. B2, sure, too. And 11, Crux. Ayla realized that Ren, Shore, and Crux were not titles at all. They were directions. She remembered Evra's navigation shelf for reference texts, where every regularly used book had its own shorthand name. R7, she knew, should lead them to a particular place on that shelf. She counted. 7 in from the right of the reference shelf, 7th shelf up from the floor. Her fingers found a volume, Resonance Patterns in Urban Lane Networks, 3rd edition. She opened it. Inside the back cover, in small, neat handwriting, a key. Pages. Correspondences. A cipher. Simple but specific letter substitutions, but the substitution set was built from the names of medicinal plants in a particular traditional classification system. The cipher, Ayla saw, had been built from herbalist taxonomy. Anyone outside healing would miss the pattern. Anyone inside healing would likely assume it was ordinary notation. Cade recognized the elegance of the work, personal enough to hide in plain sight, clean enough to survive scrutiny. Ayla decided they should begin with R7 Ren. If Evra had kept to her own logic, that would be the starting point. Together they worked. Cade held the cipher. Ayla read the journal, parsing each encoded line. The writing beneath the code was in shorthand itself, Evra's own compressed note-taking, full of abbreviations and symbol systems built from 35 years of professional practice. But this Ayla could read fluently. Had learned to read it over years of standing behind Evra's shoulder, deciphering what looked like noise and discovering, always, precision. Evra's voice came off the pages slowly, then all at once, the way immersion always works, a threshold crossed invisibly, and then you are inside the thing and not outside it. The first journal was dated from 5 years ago. It began with clinical observations, the dry shorthand of a working healer noting anomalies in her patient caseload. Third week running, presenting cases of lay sensitivity diminishment. Not gradual. Not the normal aging curve. Sudden reduction. 2 patients this week with 0 history of lay interaction difficulty. When I mapped their exposure vectors, there is a neighborhood correlation I cannot account for organically. The lines beneath the Thornwick district are doing something I don't recognize. Making inquiries. Cade wanted to know where Evra first named the condition as the Ashening. Ayla noted that Evra had not named it yet. In this early entry, she still called it the reduction. She had been proving what it was before giving it a name. The months progressed. The observations sharpened. By the second year, Evra had a map, sketched in the back of the first journal, meticulous, of Veilport's lay network, with markers indicating where she'd observed cases. The markers formed a pattern that was not random. They clustered along specific junction points in the lay network, the places where lines crossed, where the network's power was most concentrated. The reduction does not spread along the lines uniformly. It seeds at junctions and propagates outward. This is not natural pathology. Natural lay degradation, historical record, Voss-Harwick survey of 1987, Marathi monograph 2003, is diffuse, gradual, title. This is targeted. Junctions chosen. Sequence deliberate. Someone who understands the network architecture has introduced something at the nodes. Cade saw that Evra had been certain this was not ordinary decay. She believed someone had built it. Ayla understood the implication. Evra had seen the pattern 3 years before anyone else was willing to call it one. They opened the second journal. The B2, shore volumes. The tone had shifted, still the same compressed shorthand, still the same clinical precision, but underneath it now a current of something else. Urgency, perhaps. Or something darker than urgency. I have been tracking this long enough to understand that the person who designed this system has a sophisticated knowledge of how midnight healers interact with the lay network. The reduction is not simply stripping practitioner capacity. It is specifically targeting the pathways a healer uses during the witching window. This is not collateral damage. This is the target. Someone is trying to make healing impossible. Not magic broadly. Healing specifically. I have taken to calling him the architect. He has a design. He has been patient. I intend to find him before his design is finished. Ayla read that sentence twice. She felt something cold settle in her chest, not new cold, but a deepening of the cold that had been there for months, the cold of suspicion that had not yet found the shape of certainty. Evra had known. She had been tracking this alone, in coded journals hidden beneath warded floorboards, for years. She had not told the Veil. She had not told Ayla. She had told no one, because she had understood, and this, reading it, was the particular anguish of it. She had understood that the infrastructure she would normally report to could not be trusted. The realization landed hard. Evra had kept all of this from her. She said it quietly, to no one in particular. Cade didn't respond. She wasn't asking him to. Ayla understood that Evra had known what the Ashening was becoming. She had tracked it for years and never told her. Cade urged her to keep going, because the next page might explain why Evra had kept the investigation hidden. His voice was steady. Not indifferent. She was beginning, slowly, to learn the difference in him, but steady in the way of someone who knows that the rest of the picture matters before the feeling lands. She trusted that steadiness. She turned the page. The second B2, Shore Volume B2, Shore 2, was from the last 18 months of Evra's life. The handwriting was the same, the precision was the same, but the entries were longer, and between them were pasted items, a receipt in a hand she didn't recognize, a small diagram of what appeared to be a junction access mechanism, 2 pages of observations about a specific area of the ley network near Veilport's central spine, the place known in practitioner circles as the Great Latitude, where the city's oldest and most powerful ley lines intersected directly beneath the old quarter. Directly beneath, Ayla noted with a slow settling of something in her gut, this street, this house. Met again with the contact from the cartography division. He does not know what I'm tracking. I have given him a different context for my questions. But he has confirmed the central junction has been accessed twice in the past year by someone with a very specific level of clearance. Not practitioner clearance. Administrative clearance. Veil clearance. Only 5 people in the current Veil regional structure have the grade of access required to reach the central junction without triggering the standard monitoring arrays. I am working to narrow the 5. Kate identified the access immediately. Veil clearance, not practitioner access, administrative access. He said it with no particular inflection, but she saw his jaw tighten by a fraction. Ayla recognized that he knew the system from the inside. Kate admitted that he did. He didn't look away from the page. She didn't make him. She opened the final journal. N11 Crux. The handwriting was unchanged, but the entries came faster now, shorter, more urgent. The compression of someone who is writing quickly because time is beginning to feel finite. She read entries about narrowing down the 5 names, about following a thread in the financial records of a Veil subsidiary, about a meeting she'd had with someone whose name she'd coded separately, someone who had brought her evidence she described only as the proof of access, about the growing certainty that the Ashening was not simply corruption in the network, but something introduced, a specific pathogen, for want of a better term, engineered to target the architecture of the ley lines at the exact frequencies used by midnight healers during the witching window. If I am right, and I am right, then there is a specific mechanism. The seeding requires physical access to the junction nodes. You cannot do this remotely. You cannot do this with practitioner-level power alone. You need a key. A physical key in the older sense, a resonance instrument built to open the protected layers of a junction access point. These were made, historically, in sets of 3. One held by the Veil. One by the city's lead healer. One destroyed in the reform of 1923, or so the official record states. I believe the 3rd key was not destroyed. I believe it was kept. I believe the architect has it. I have one more lead to follow before I can put a name to him. If I'm right about who it is, then. She turned the page. The next entry was the last. It was written in a hand that was still precise, still steady. She had been steady, always. Evra had been steady, but the entry was brief. 3 lines. And the 3rd line ended mid-sentence, the pen dragging off to one side as though something had been interrupted. Have confirmed the lead. It is who I suspected. I am going to report this formally, but I need to secure the evidence first. The architect has a key to the central junction. If he uses it, the network will. Scene 4. They stayed where they were for a long time. Cade closed the journal carefully and set it at the edge of the desk, apart from the others. He did not speak. Ayla appreciated this with a gratitude that was entirely wordless. There are people in the world, well-meaning, loving, genuinely good, who cannot tolerate silence in the presence of grief, who fill it because the alternative feels like an abandonment. She had encountered them in the weeks after Evra's death, had understood their intentions, had exhausted herself against the constant pressure to respond to the comfort being offered. Cade did not do this. He sat in the chair beside her in Evra's study and was simply present, the way weight is present, and she understood for the first time that this, too, was a kind of skill. She looked at the last journal entry for a long time. The line that broke off. The drag of the pen. She had made herself look at it directly, the way you make yourself look at a hard thing, making the eyes do what the mind is reluctant to, and now she was holding what it meant in both hands, the way you hold something very cold or very fragile. Evra had known who the architect was. She had been in the process of writing it down. And then something had happened. The death certificate had said cardiac failure, sudden, apparently natural, the kind of thing that happens to women in their 60s, even the ones who are brilliant and careful and irreplaceable. The kind of thing that is noted and filed and classified and never examined closely if no one is looking closely. And no one had been looking closely because Evra had been looking closely and then Evra was gone. Ayla understood that Evra had known she was in danger. She saw now how carefully Evra had built the ward, coded the journals, and hidden the work where only Ayla would know how to find it. Perhaps Evra had been protecting her. Perhaps she had believed there was more time. Perhaps she had thought she could carry the burden alone. But she had died with the answer almost written, and Ayla had not been there. She stopped. Not composing herself, she was past the performance of composure in this house today, but because the sentence had reached its weight limit and couldn't carry any more. Cade understood the calculation. Evra had kept Ayla out because bringing her in would have put her directly in the line of fire. Ayla believed she could have helped her. Cade did not deny that. But he pointed out that the moment Ayla helped, she would have become visible to the same people hunting Evra. Evra had made a hard calculation. Ayla could hate the result, but it had not been abandonment. Evra had been protecting the investigation, protecting Ayla, and trying to carry something no one should have carried alone. Ayla looked at him. He was looking at the desk, at the journals, the cipher, the map, and his expression was careful in the way she had come to recognize as the face he wore when something had landed personally, and he was deciding how much of that to surface. Ayla realized Cade was not guessing. He knew what that kind of calculation cost. A long silence. Cade had learned it from someone at the Veil, not family, not refuge, not the way Ayla had learned from Evra, but someone who had taught him how to survive the field. That man had also found something too large to carry, kept it from Cade, and run until it broke him. Ayla was sorry he had learned that lesson in such a way. Cade was sorry too. Some lessons, he knew, stayed in the room long after the person who taught them was gone. Ayla knew he was right. Some lessons did stay. He looked at her then. His amber brown eyes were very direct and for once not doing any of the work they usually did, the calculation, the assessment. The maintained distance that was the professional reflex of someone trained to read rooms and keep himself out of the thing he was reading. He was just looking at her. The way a person looks at another person when they are, simply, with them. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Outside, the wind had gentled. The quality of the light through the study window was shifting toward the particular thin gold of late morning, and it fell across the desk, across the journals, across the two of them sitting in the chair and the straight-backed thing from the corner, and Ayla thought, she would have liked you, and didn't say it, because it would have required explaining everything that was compressed into the thought, and she wasn't sure she was ready to explain it yet. She filed it in a place she could reach later. She picked up the last journal again. Not to read, she had read it. She held it the way you hold something of a person's when that person is not coming back. The physical fact of the object in her hands, the weight of it, the specific texture of the cloth binding. Evra had held this, had written in it, had set it down on some evening now 6 months gone, and never come back to finish the sentence. Ayla needed the architect's name, not a suspicion, not a shape in the dark, but the name itself. Cade answered with quiet certainty. Then they would find it. Evra had left evidence, the cartography contact, the financial thread, the proof of access. If Ayla could find what Evra had secured, she could finish the sentence Evra never had the chance to complete. Cade promised she would not have to find it alone. If she gave him time, he would open every door he still knew how to open. He said it without apparent awareness of saying it, as though it required no particular decision. She noticed. She let it stand. Ayla understood that if the architect held a key to the central junction, the threat had moved beyond the edges. The heart of the network was exposed. Cade saw the implication. The damage would not remain local. It would travel through the whole system. Ayla understood the scale. Every sensitive in Veilport would feel it first, then every connected junction and every city tied into the old lines. The Ashening would not merely take power, it would take memory, will, identity, everything the lines knew how to carry. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Cade's face was very still. Cade asked how many people would be exposed if the Ashening reached that far. Ayla answered that in Veilport alone, every sensitive in the city would be exposed. A third of the population carried some thread of lay connection, and perhaps 40,000 had enough sensitivity to be harmed first. After that, the damage would move through the old network, every connected city, every junction point, every place the lines still remembered how to carry them. She stopped again, set the journal down, pressed both palms flat on the desk surface and breathed. Cade concluded that they would have to move carefully and that they would have to move now. Ayla agreed with the careful part, but not with the slow part. They sat for another few minutes in the gold-angled quiet of the study. It was not a comfortable silence, and it was not an uncomfortable one. It was the specific silence of two people who have arrived at the true scale of a thing and are taking a moment to breathe before they begin. She thought about Evra, about the 22 years of her life that had been structured around this woman's presence, the lessons, the arguments, the particular texture of being loved by someone who expected the best from you precisely because she'd looked carefully and seen exactly what you were capable of. About the cardigan in the sitting room, the crossword, the sparrow in the rain, the mug on its hook. The ley lines don't give you power. They lend it. You are the interest on their loan. Never forget what you're spending. She had not forgotten. She had sometimes wished she could. But she had not forgotten. Cade still had a contact, a former shade who had kept access to the deep archive, the part of the Veil record system that was supposed to disappear when people like him stopped being useful. She owed him enough to answer, and if anything had been sealed inside Evra's death file, he could ask her to look. Ayla told him to ask her. Cade warned that if the file had been scrubbed properly, there might be nothing left to find. Ayla was certain there would be something. Evra had left a trail because she wanted it followed. She said it with a certainty that wasn't bravado. It was a simpler thing, the certainty of someone who has been looking at the shape of a thing long enough to recognize it, and has recognized, just now, that the shape she has been looking at is not random. Has never been random. Scene 5, Cliffhanger. Cade worked the contact through an encrypted channel, the kind that involved 3 layers of misdirection and a routing system so outdated that modern interception software didn't recognize it as a communication channel at all. because nobody who built modern interception software believed anyone was still using it. The contact, he'd called her once, briefly, from across the room, a name that may have been a call sign, or may have been a name Ayla couldn't determine, which responded in under 4 minutes, which told its own story about how available she was, and perhaps about the nature of what she owed him. Ayla did not look over his shoulder. She sat at the other end of the desk with Evra's map of the ley network, tracing the cluster points Evra had marked with her small, precise indicators, understanding more now with each pass, could see the logic of the seeding pattern, could see which junctions had been hit, could see which ones had not yet, and understand why. They were working toward something, toward the center. The sequence was, now that she could read it, terrifyingly deliberate. A spiral inward. Kate said Ayla's name once, and the quiet that followed told her everything. He didn't say anything else. He said her name, and then was quiet, which was how she knew. She set down the map. She stood. She crossed to where he sat and looked at the document on his device, and he turned the screen so she could read it clearly, and she read it. It was a death certificate. Standard Veilport administrative format. She had seen others, in her professional capacity, when her work brought her into contact with the formal machinery of the city's practitioner record-keeping. Name, date of birth, date of death. Cause of death.
Voss, Evran Keshi.
Date of birth, March 14th, 1962. Date of death, 7 September, 3:17 hours. Cause of death, cardiac failure, acute onset. Attending healer, redacted. Filed by Veil Regional Office, Veilport District. Classification, restricted, level 9. She read it again. The whole document. Slowly. Every line. Level 9 classification. There were 12 levels of Veil classification. She knew this from Cade, from the months of reluctant exposition he had offered in pieces, because she needed to understand the structure of the organization she was apparently now in covert opposition to. Level 9 was not used for deaths. Level 9 was reserved for information that, if released, would, in the Veil's own operational language, compromise the structural integrity of the governing framework. It was the level used for things the Veil did not want examined. Not merely private. Not simply sensitive. Not to be examined. Actively, institutionally shielded. And the filing time. The death certificate had been filed at 3:17. She had asked the neighbors. She had done this quietly, 3 months ago, without knowing exactly why, because the instinct to ask had seemed important, and the neighbors had told her that the concern had begun at 6 in the morning. Mrs. Aldred at number 16 had tried to bring Evra her milk delivery at 6, as she sometimes did when the mornings were cold, and had found no answer, and had eventually called the practitioner's emergency line at 6:45, which meant that the death certificate had been filed at 3:17 in the morning. 2 hours and 45 minutes, at minimum, before the first person had noticed Evra might be gone. 3 hours and 28 minutes before the emergency call was placed. The Veil Regional Office had filed a death certificate for Ayla Voss at 3:17 in the morning, before anyone knew she was dead. Cade noted that the attending healer's name had been redacted, and that names were only hidden that way when the name itself would expose the machinery behind the record. Ayla saw another possibility. There might have been no attending healer at all, only a convenient fiction placed there so no one had to ask why Evra's death had been certified before anyone even knew she was gone. She said it without inflection. The way you say a thing when you have moved past the register of shock and into the register of understanding, that cold, high country where the air is thin and everything is very clear. Cade told Ayla to breathe before she followed that thought all the way to its teeth. Ayla understood the sequence with cold clarity. The Veil had known before the neighbors knew, before the emergency line was called, before anyone should have known. That meant someone in the Veil had been there, had been told instantly, or had helped ensure there was a death to certify. Cade cautioned that the certificate proved involvement, knowledge, and the authority to bury the record before the body was even found. It did not yet prove murder, and he needed them alive long enough to prove the rest. Ayla saw Evra inches from the name, the journal open, and the evidence almost secured, before the pen stopped. By morning, the city had believed Evra had simply died. But at 3:17, the Veil had already written the ending for her. He was very still. Ayla understood why Cade was choosing caution. Cade knew that accusation without proof would give the Veil a clean target. Once they moved against the institution would move back, quietly, efficiently, and with every advantage it possessed. He was not asking Ayla to doubt what she knew. He was asking her to let the proof catch up before the Veil caught them. Ayla understood. The Veil would not merely deny this. They would answer it. She looked at the device again. At the death certificate. At the name in the classification field Level 9 and the blacked-out space where an attending healer's name should have been. She thought of Evra at her desk. The pen dragging across the paper. The sentence that didn't finish. The architect has a key to the central junction. If he uses it, the network will. She thought of a sparrow in a garden, tested by rain, discovering it was whole. She thought of a woman in a terracotta cardigan who had looked at a terrified 16-year-old and told her to sit down before she knocked something else over, and had meant it as the most generous thing she knew how to say. She thought of 12 years of learning from someone who had, it turned out, been carrying something enormous, been carrying it alone, and had still had room, such room, for all the ordinary appointments of being loved and loving. The crossword and the terrible mug and the stone in the pocket and the laugh that was still visible in a photograph somewhere in the dim hallway downstairs. She looked up from the device. Cade was watching her with the careful, quiet attention of someone who understands that a thing is being decided and knows enough to wait for the decision to be finished. Her violet gray eyes were not wet. They were not soft. They were the eyes of someone who has absorbed a blow and is not staggered by it, not because the blow didn't land, but because the ground beneath her feet is deeper than the blow. They were the eyes of someone whose grief had finished the slow work of converting itself into something harder and more load-bearing. Something that will hold weight. Something built for a long walk. They were decided. Ayla knew Evra had known the name. She had been close enough to write it down, and she had secured proof before trying to report it. That proof still existed somewhere, in the house, with a cartography contact, or hidden in a place Ayla had not yet learned how to see. Cade resolved that they would follow the trail, find the proof, and find the name. Ayla understood what came next. They had to find the architect before he reached the central junction. Cade raised the harder question, what they would do if the Veil stood between them and that goal. She looked at the death certificate one final time. At the classification. At the blacked-out name. At the timestamp that could not be explained by any innocent narrative. Ayla decided that if the Veil stood in the way, then it had chosen its side. It had known Evra was close. It had buried the file before anyone knew she was dead. Whether its people had held the knife or merely opened the door for it, they had chosen. She set the device down very carefully on the desk, beside the journals. Beside the cipher. Beside the map Evra had drawn of a network being slowly consumed from within. And if the Veil had chosen that, then there was no one left to report to. There was only them. Cade Morrow, former Veil enforcer, Shade, a man who had spent 12 years operating in the precise gray area between the institution and its purposes, looked at the woman across the desk, the last true midnight healer, silver-streaked, violet-eyed, grief-tempered, decided, and something in his face made a small, quiet change. Not dramatic. Not announced. The way the sky changes color in the minutes before dawn, incrementally, undeniably, permanently. He nodded once. End of Episode 5. The Midnight Healer. Episode 6. The Cartography of Grief. Coming next. Production credits, Episode 5. Written as an original work of urban fantasy fiction. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are fictional. The world of Veilport, the Midnight Healers, the Ashening, and the Veil are original creations.